Hello there, this is part 8 of my pre-HD Skyward Sword Deep Dive series. If you'd like to see the other parts, there will be a link to the full playlist in the description. In the previous part, I talked about each of Skyward Sword's dungeons, so I'd recommend watching that first. Enjoy! A good dungeon boss is a key part of the equation. Bosses provide a satisfying final challenge while thematically tying the dungeon together. They're the final impression of each dungeon, which can greatly impact your experience. And unfortunately, Skyward Sword's dungeon bosses almost universally harm the dungeons that they're in. I've already talked about how the duels with Girohen are fantastic and challenging boss fights on their own, and the first encounter with him really puts your early game sword skills to the test. He'll hold up his sword like the basic bokoblins you've been fighting, but you only get a few seconds to react before he strikes, and if you make a wrong move, he'll immediately counterattack, so you have to be quick and precise with your swings or be harshly punished. He also puts a twist on this by teleporting around randomly, and he can even teleport behind you, so you have to constantly be on your toes, and it tests your speed with the camera controls as well. Girohen can mix up your sword swinging by creating lines of projectiles that you can deflect by swiping your sword the right way at the right time. It's a test of your timing with the sword instead of your reaction speed. He'll also quickly dash at you and you have to parry right before he hits you. It's one of the few instances in the game where parrying is really tested since it actually requires good timing, and missing a parry can take a huge chunk out of your shield durability. If you lose your shield during this fight, then you'll have to slash him at exactly the moment before he swings or skillfully dodge, which is very challenging. It honestly is a fantastic fight that puts a full variety of combat skills to the test. But there is a major problem here, and that this is the first boss in the game. His moveset is just too complex and unforgiving. It's a nasty difficulty spike to have only a few hours in. And skills like effective parrying and quick camera control haven't been tested to this degree yet, which can make it really disorienting. Skyview Temple is an incredibly simplistic and easy dungeon. The most complicated encounters before this only involve doing simple sword strikes on stationary targets, which doesn't even come close to this. Girohen also has way too much health, and it's unclear how much damage you're even doing to him, which can make the fight feel grueling. It's honestly very frustrating and hurts the game's difficulty scaling. This isn't a matter of just getting good. Like I said, I did love this fight because of how challenging it was, and I do think that the point was to be overwhelming and disorienting, but the challenge has to be built up to properly, and it just isn't here. I don't think the fight even needed to be changed in any way, it just needed to come later in the game. Bosses like Puppet Ganon in Wind Waker and Zant in Twilight Princess are also overwhelming and disorienting fights, but they're both fantastic because the game has had the time to properly introduce you to all of the mechanics that will be used in these fights. And even if you do enjoy the challenge of Girohen, it creates another problem, which is that it establishes an expectation of depth with those combat mechanics going forward that the game does not follow up on until the Sandship mini-boss. Until then, you're back to fighting basic enemies, and none of the other bosses test your sword mechanics like this, which makes everything that comes after Girohen feel very underwhelming in comparison. Speaking of, the next two bosses are both very underwhelming, but especially in comparison. Skaldera is ridiculously basic. It's just a boulder with legs and you're throwing bombs into its big mouth and then stabbing it. It looks ridiculous, and there's very little challenge or intrigue to the fight. Rolling bombs down a slope at least adds something here, but if you just stand there mindlessly throwing bombs at it over and over again, it can't even attack you. This boss is a joke. I guess you were rolling around on a boulder in the Earth Temple, so fighting a boulder at least sort of fits for the dungeon. Moldurak is even worse than Skaldera. It's easily one of the most forgettable dungeon bosses in the entire series. It's a completely generic-looking scorpion monster, which is such a waste for the incredibly unique setting of the mining facility. The fight is really lame too. You're just slashing its claws when they're open in a simple motion puzzle, only slightly more involved than that of previous mini-bosses. It can also burrow under the sand, but that doesn't add anything to the fight besides letting you use the Gust Bellows because you got it in the dungeon. But the Gust Bellows were already used in creative ways in combat with the Armos, so it feels like an afterthought here. The mining facility was so rich with potential for a really creative boss, like some sort of ancient mechanical security system, or a boss fight using mine carts or conveyor belts or time shift stones or anything introduced in the dungeon. Moldrak is nothing more than a simple test of the sword mechanics. If it had been the first boss of the game, this fight would have been basically fine, but we fought Girohen as the first boss, which was a far more involved test of the sword mechanics than this, so this fight feels pointless. Even worse, you fight Moldrak again randomly in the overworld with no changes to it, which completely cheapens the fact that this was supposed to be a dungeon boss. If it had been the first boss, and then you fought it again much later on, this moment would have actually been really cool, but you fought it way too recently, so it feels very underwhelming as a result. I honestly think that if the Moldrak and Girohen fights had switched places, it would have helped both of them have a far better impact. Plus, fighting Girohen would have made way more sense in the mining facility, since he shows up here to attack you for explicit story purposes and then just kind of leaves. Like, why didn't you fight him here instead? Koloktos is the shining exception to the rule here, as it's actually one of the single best boss fights of the entire Zelda series. Everything about this boss is amazing. The visual design is impeccable, and it thematically mixes the elegant machinery of the ancient cistern with the sinister malevolence of the underworld perfectly. The fight itself makes great use of the whip as a dungeon item too. In the first half, Koloktos is stationary and guarding its weak point with its 6 arms, so you have to wait until it attacks to decisively strike and tear off its arms one by one. It feels like you're in a strategic back and forth where you're steadily gaining the upper hand. Then in the second half, Koloktos flips the table on you by tearing itself out of the ground and aggressively pursuing you around the arena. The steady and measured first half has given way to a turbulent cat and mouse chase. You're on the constant defensive while it's swinging these gigantic blades around and destroying chunks of the scenery until you can find an opening to rip off its arms and steal one of its massive blades to use it to tear Koloktos to shreds. It's so satisfying because Koloktos is really intimidating until you can find a chance to turn the tables on it. And the delayed swings of the massive sword give every one of your attacks such a feeling of power behind them, and between the explosive crunching of metal and the almost viscous dark energy spewing from where you land your hits, the game feel is spot on. It's an amazing experience, and one of the greatest highlights of Skyward Sword, and adds so much to the ancient cistern as a dungeon. So then, when the boss of the sand ship is Tantalus, it's that much more disappointing that we're back to ridiculously mediocre boss design. Tantalus is extremely ugly, and it's so pathetic looking for how much build-up it gets, and it wastes the unique setting of the sand ship even more than Moldrak did for the mining facility. The whole point of the sand ship is that it's a mechanical galleon taken over by robot pirates, so why does the boss fight squander this unique concept by being a totally generic sea monster? The boss could have had something to do with the robot pirate crew, or it could even have been a mechanical sea monster to at least match the sand ship's unique concept. It would be like if the boss of the ancient cistern was Morpha from Ocarina of Time, because there's water here, I guess. The fight itself is awful too. You're just shooting it in the massive glowing eyeball with your bow while it stands almost completely still. It's an incredibly simplistic take on one of the single most basic boss concepts in Zelda, and it isn't expanded on here in any way. Like, having a clearly indicated weak point is completely fine for gameplay readability, but if you aren't asked to do anything besides just hit the weak point with no obstacles, then what's even the point? Koloktos also has a clearly indicated weak point, but making the weak point accessible is the challenge of the boss, and it's actually engaging to do. Even Queen Goma from Ocarina of Time at least required some sense of positioning and timing with the slingshot, and it was the first boss of that game. The Tantalus fight is also split up by these segments where the fight completely stops and you have to hit tentacles with skyward strikes, which is so disjointed and slow and drags the fight out for so long. And then in the final phase, Tantalus sends this endless barrage of attacks at you, but all you have to do is stand in place and wildly swing your sword around until it arbitrarily decides to stop attacking you so that you can shoot it in the eye again. This entire boss is so tiring and utterly uninspired. I'm not even against shooting a stationary target with the bow, but it should at least be involved in some way. Like, you spent the entire sand ship shooting at a timeshift stone from different angles, and there was so much creative potential to use this idea in a boss fight. You could have used the time shift stone to switch to the present and trap Tantalus in the desert sand, or to switch between different time periods to reposition yourself around the arena, or even to make Tantalus turn really old and feeble so you can hit it easier, so the boss would at least have some personality to it. Honestly, even just a fairly average boss fight for the Sandship would have been fine, but Tantalus is the worst dungeon boss in this game, which is another major tick against the Sandship. Especially since the Robot Pirate Captain mini-boss was so fantastic. Why wasn't that just the dungeon boss instead? It's honestly so much better than this in every way. Whew, okay, sorry, I'm getting a bit ranty again. Let's take it down a notch. You get to fight Girohen again at the end of the Fire Sanctuary, and again, this is a really satisfying and incredible boss fight on its own. This encounter successfully builds off of the previous one with several new moves and patterns to learn, and it's so much more intense. He wields 2 swords now, which not only means his guard is twice as effective and harder to predict, but also he can attack you twice in a row and do twice as much damage, so you really have to be on your toes this time. If you attack him when he isn't guarding, he'll quickly block with one of his swords and hold it in place. So you can actually use this to your advantage to quickly force him to block in 2 different directions and then strike him from a third, which really gives you a chance to be proactive in this fight instead of only reactive. He can still teleport behind you, but now he can also teleport and crash down on your head, so you have to constantly keep an eye on his tells and change up your strategy on the fly. And his projectiles are far more quick and complex and really test your timing and reflexes. It's honestly an incredible boss fight. It's a real test of your mastery with the sword, and it doesn't feel unfair like the first fight was because it takes place on a natural difficulty curve this time. It's also a fantastic way to cap off the second act of the game, which makes it even more clear to me that the first Girohen fight should have capped off the first act. Despite this, there's one glaring flaw with this fight that I can't really ignore. Why is Girohen the boss fight of the Fire Sanctuary? He has nothing to do with this dungeon at all. Skyward Temple had an incredibly basic theme and was mostly about learning the sword combat, so fighting Girohen there at least kind of made sense, but the Fire Sanctuary is a clearly defined fire temple that centers on using water to douse fire and solidify lava. I don't think a boss even needs to use the dungeon's mechanics to be successful, but it should still have something to do with the dungeon that you fight it in. Bongo Bongo in Ocarina of Time doesn't use the hover boots at all, but it's a great boss because it has very strong thematic ties with the Shadow Temple, and Adolwa in Majora's Mask can be fought pretty much however you want, but he's directly tied to Woodfall Temple and couldn't be fought anywhere else. Girohen doesn't have anything to do with the Fire Sanctuary and is just kind of there. Even in Skyview Temple, he was pursuing Zelda to the Skyview Spring, but here there's some really weak explanation about how he finds out there's a second gate of time from a mural on the wall, but he didn't need to figure that out here, since the Imprisoned is already trying to reach Zelda in the Sealed Temple at this point, and Girohen should be able to figure that out on his own. Even though he's a fantastic boss, you could have fought Girohen literally anywhere. Skyward Sword doesn't shy away from having bosses in the overworld. You even fight Girohen in the overworld later on. I genuinely feel that he detracts from the Fire Sanctuary as a dungeon, which already struggles with its shoddy theming and mechanics and really could have used a strong dungeon boss to help tie it together. It's a problem with every dungeon boss in this game. Even some of the weakest bosses in other Zelda games at least capitalize in some way on the theme of the dungeon that they exist in. King Dodongo in Ocarina of Time is about as mechanically weak as Scaldera, but he's King Dodongo of Dodongo's Cavern. This entire dungeon is about Dodongos. You've been fighting different kinds of Dodongos throughout the entire dungeon, and the central fixture of the cavern is a giant Dodongo skull, while Scaldera is just a random boulder, and the Earth Temple is full of dragon imagery. You couldn't fight King Dodongo anywhere else, but you literally do fight dungeon bosses in Skyward Sword in random other locations because they're so unimportant to the dungeons themselves. The unique settings of each dungeon aren't played to in Skyward Sword's bosses, and the mechanics on display are incredibly weak. The only exception is Koloktos, which is one of the single best bosses in the entire series, but because of that, it makes the other bosses that much worse. If all of the bosses were bad, I could maybe just write them all off, but Skyward Sword proves it's capable of making visually, mechanically, and thematically fantastic bosses with Collectos, and then just chooses not to for the rest of them. And this problem spreads to the overworld bosses as well. Levias is a boss fight in the sky, which is visually pretty cool, but he's handled so poorly. You randomly find out right before fighting him that everyone in Skyloft already knows Levias, including Link, and that he lives in the Thunderhead and people regularly visit and have chats with him there. There's never been any mention or build-up to this before now, and you've been in the Thunderhead at least 3 different times at this point, without even an inclination that he exists. There's virtually no setup to this encounter at all. He could have been flying around in the Thunderhead until now, and you couldn't interact with him or damage him in any way to build up to the fight, since after you defeat him, he continues flying around for the rest of the game. Why couldn't he fly around before the fight as well? Nature and Breath of the Wild has a really similar setup to this, but you're never told that they exist, so discovering Nature is really exciting, and there's a real sense of mystery since you don't even know what this creature is. Levias is completely demystified before you even see him, because you're told about him in a really offhand way during a casual conversation, and he isn't treated with any sense of importance. It's like being told to go talk to Fred from accounting and not an ancient and mystical sky spirit. The boss fight itself is really boring and frustrating because of the poor flying controls. Levias doesn't even attack you. You're just slowly flying around hitting the clearly indicated weak points. Right before this boss fight, you're forced to do an awful aerial target-breaking minigame to prove you understand the flying mechanics that will be used in this boss, but the minigame is significantly harder than Levias, which makes the boss fight feel so weak. Half the fight does take place against Bilosite on Levias' back, so at least you don't have to fly anymore, but you're just doing simple sword motions to deflect projectiles and then shooting it in the giant glowing eye, which again is so incredibly basic. It's something you've been doing against several bosses to this point. The Girohen fight before Levias tests your ability to deflect projectiles with sword swings in a far more complex and challenging way, and it's really unclear what's even going on with Bilosite. You have to deflect the projectiles to hit the sides of its head before shooting it in the eye, but there's no real indication of this since the massive eyeball is the obvious weak point that you're clearly being drawn to. It's both more unclear and far less involved than the Girohen fight before it. Shooting it in the eye with a bow at least asks a little more of you than Tantalus did, since Bilosite does move around a bit, but it's still just not interesting in any way. And despite being a total failure of a boss in almost every way, it still isn't even the worst boss Skyward Sword has to offer. This brings me to the Imprisoned. There's a very good reason why the Imprisoned is top of many lists of worst Zelda bosses of all time, and that's because not only is it a truly horrendous boss fight on its own, but like many other things in this game, you're forced to do it 3 times and it gets progressively worse every time you do it. The Imprisoned is unique in that it's a mobile boss that's steadily climbing up a spiral canyon. Having a mobile boss that you have to chase down isn't a bad idea in itself. Goat from Majora's Mask is a fantastic example of this type of boss. However, the Imprisoned has a built-in fail state. If it reaches the top of the canyon, you automatically get a game over and have to start the fight over again. This is a terrible decision. I think it was done so the fight would be really tense to make it exciting, but since it's a really lengthy and utterly unenjoyable affair, failing and having to start over is far too punishing, which makes the Imprisoned distressing in a bad way. At first, the Imprisoned can only slowly walk forward. You have to run underneath its feet and whack its toes to knock it over, then run all the way back behind it and whack it in the head to damage it, then rinse and repeat 2 more times, which is really slow going and tedious. You can climb up the cliffside and then jump down onto its head to damage it more easily, but it's not that much better since you have to find the closest air spout, slowly ride it up, run to reach the right position, and then jump down on top of it. But if you jump on the Imprisoned at the wrong time, you'll get knocked off and have to try again, which wastes your limited time. Plus, each time you damage it, it starts sliding forward on its belly and becomes invulnerable. So all you can do is wait for it to stand back up again while it's steadily getting closer to the top of the canyon. The first fight is manageable enough, but because there's so much uninteresting running back and forth and there are segments where you can't do anything, it's just frustrating. The second fight against it is a lot worse than this, though. The Imprisoned is walking faster, and every one of its footsteps makes shockwaves that knock you down. There's no reliable way to dodge these, so hitting its toes is very difficult without getting knocked around like a pinball, which is ridiculously aggravating. You now have the bow, but hitting its toes with the bow takes too long, and it's too unreliable when time is of the essence before a game over. To help deal with the added difficulty, you now have access to the Grusinator, which lets you lob bombs to stun the Imprisoned. This is an entirely new mechanic that you have to learn to use mid-fight, which is just too stressful during a very tense boss fight with a built-in fail state. There should have been practice beforehand. You also can't control Link while using the Grusinator, which means that after using it, you're often left very far out of position and have to scramble to reposition yourself. The Imprisoned itself has also grown arms and tries to climb up the cliffside, so you need to hit it with the Grusinator to make it stop, otherwise you'll have to climb up the cliffside and slash at its fingers, which is slow and awkward. Plus, now when you knock the Imprisoned over, you often can't run behind it to hit its head because the arms are in the way, so you have to scale up and down the cliffs to get around and damage it. No matter how you approach this fight, it's just miserable and stressful. The third fight is somehow even worse than this. In the first phase, the Imprisoned is sprinting and making endless shockwaves, making it a horrible experience to try and damage or even keep up with it. Stunning it with the Grusinator only gives you enough time to damage 2 to 3 of its toes before it starts walking again, and it's walking so fast it's hard to land on its head from a cliffside above it. After you damage its head once, though, the Imprisoned can suddenly fly, and it only takes about a minute to reach the top of the canyon, so a single mistake here can mean game over. After bombing it once, you lose access to bombs, so now you have to climb the entire canyon to the top and run all the way to Gruz, which takes a solid 20 to 30 seconds, and you have to fire yourself out of the cannon onto its back, which is something you've never had to do before, and because it takes so long to get to the top of the canyon, you only get one shot before an almost certain game over. This is absolutely atrocious, giving players 1 minute to react to something they've never had to do before or suffer a game over is unforgivably bad game design. The third fight against the Imprisoned alone is the single worst boss in all of Zelda history, let alone considering that you had to fight it 2 other times before this. The Imprisoned is yet another major blemish on this title, and is honestly symptomatic of the severe issues that plague much of Skyward Sword's gameplay as a whole. It's a new type of game experience to try and inject some variety into the stale Zelda formula, and it's an interesting concept that makes for a cool set piece, but it's terribly executed and miserable to experience, and I'm losing track of how many times I've said that at this point. The Imprisoned is also symptomatic of the biggest issue that I have with Skyward Sword. Despite all of the myriad of gameplay issues on display, from the overused motion controls, unimpactful game systems, half-developed overworld, circuitous progression, surface-level variety, burdened dungeon design, and inadequate bosses, the worst part of Skyward Sword to me is the story that strings it all together. In the next part of this deep dive, I'll be talking about the characters in Skyward Sword's story, including each of the main characters as well as various other NPCs. There will be a playlist in the description that'll update once that part is completed. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you there!